Hey everyone, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet.
Ad Astra, the podcast where we talk about the intersection between space, policy, and technology.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
I have a Master's of Public Policy degree with a concentration in Science and Space Policy.
And I'm a PhD in Computer Science and an all-around tech geek.
And for all of you creative folks out there is still time left in our t-shirt competition. Just to remind you of the rules, maximum of 14-inch by 16-inch, 300 DPI, and use no more than 3 colors. Send your designs to Ad Astra at elemental.fm by September 30th.
So, and one more brief announcement before we get to the actual show. Before we get to our main topics, our thoughts are with the folks in Florida and up sort of the southeastern coast of the United States that have been impacted by Hurricane Irma this time. It's hurricane season. We've talked to you guys in the past about how to give to Hurricane Harvey victims. Now we're talking about how to give to Hurricane Irma victims. We're talking about the same giving organizations, the American Red Cross, who are usually the first group of people that you think of when giving after a natural disaster. It says that it's providing shelters. Their website says that they're providing shelters for those displaced by Hurricane Irma, and it has thousands of volunteers on the ground in that state. Just go to www.redcross.org/donate/Hurricane Irma donations. Global Giving is doing the same campaign that they did for Hurricane Harvey for Hurricane Irma. They're trying to raise $2 million, and they are only at $862,000. So if you have a chance, go to www.globalgiving.org/projects/hurricane-irma-relief-fund, and you can get all of this in the show notes. And please give to that, and please give to those charities. Also, Airbnb is doing another campaign specifically for victims of Hurricane Irma. They're continuing to do the campaign for Hurricane Harvey. Just search for Airbnb Hurricane Irma, and you'll find links where you can donate, where you can volunteer a place anywhere in the southeastern United States, preferably to not have people move too far from their original homes. And you can help out Hurricane Irma evacuees. That storm caused a lot of damage to a lot of folks. I even have family members down there that were impacted by it. So please give anything that you can. And now on to the show. Jack, what do we got in store for us today?
So this week's a special week. So this is going to round out our trilogy, the Science Guy trilogy, or the Science Person trilogy, rather. As many of you are aware, early on, back in the old days, we had an episode called The Last Science Guy.
Was that a Bill Nye impression?
That was a Bill Nye impression. So we had an episode called The Last Science Guy. Last week's episode was The First Science Guy. And this week we're talking about the next science person. So with us this week, we have Emily Calandrelli, who is here to talk to us about what it means to be a science advocate. Before we get on to our interview with renowned space and science communicator Emily Calandrelli, we have 2 bits of breaking news for you.
So the first bit, and it's not really breaking news. It's kind of been in the works for about 13 years.
It's breaking my heart news, okay?
It's breaking my heart news. But Cassini has taken its final plunge into Saturn, the planet that it's orbited for the last 13 years. It has finally ended its mission, and based on an orbit that it had around Titan, moving around Titan, it went perfectly into the atmosphere of Saturn and plunged to its very, very much scripted, very much timely death. But before it went, it collected high quality data for about 30 seconds longer than actually predicted. Cassini arrived in orbit originally around Saturn in 2004, and then spent the next 13 years studying the ring planet system. And we've learned more about Saturn, more about our solar system than we ever thought that we would. This thing went in to collect information about that planet maybe get some information about its rings, get a little bit of information about, well, get quite a bit of information about its moons. Huygens was crafted to drop into Titan and find something out about Titan because it appeared to be a very interesting world to explore. But we never could have imagined that we would find what we found on Titan, on Enceladus, on the other moons of Saturn, that we would find out what we could find out about Saturn, and also what we wouldn't find out about Saturn. We still don't know if Saturn has how long Saturn's day is, for instance, and we realize that because of Cassini. We are still quite uncertain about some of the hurricanes and storms that occur on Saturn, but we know more about what we don't know, and we've learned quite a bit because of this 13-year journey. And hats off to all of the scientists and engineers that worked on Cassini throughout the years. Hats off to all of the PIs, the principal investigators, Caroline Porco for evangelizing that mission. Cassini is the perfect example of what happens when you do science and engineering just right. It is the key. It's the perfect example of a worthwhile NASA mission that has not only taught us more about our solar system, but has even taught us about how our own planet works by being able to compare things like the storms that occur on Saturn to the storms that occur here, the moons of Saturn versus the moons and satellites of Earth, things like that. Cassini will be missed. I hope it is my hope that we are able to explore Saturn to a much more granular capacity and its moons going forward, with potentially landers on Enceladus and the like. But to the teams, the scientists and engineers that worked on Cassini, thank you very much for this 13-year journey. We've appreciated every bit of it.
Newton, you got me shedding a tear over here. This is a mission that we're asking questions now we would not have known to ask if it had not been for Cassini. So with that, I bid you adieu, Cassini. We'll include in the show notes some awesome videos and articles that we found about the end of Cassini, including an operatic version of Cassini's grand finale sung by a friend of the show, Robert Picardo.
Absolutely. But in other news, after that somber note, Northrop Grumman freaking brought Orbital ATK. What the
hell? You sound upset about this, Newton.
Well, I'm not upset. Let's look. People who own stock, whoever they may be at Orbital ATK, I'm sure are very happy right now.
Yeah, very happy.
I had no idea. I didn't see this coming. Did you?
So I didn't either, and I think that was the point, because there's been so much focus on this new space, and you could even make the argument that Orbital ATK is sort of new space. It's a new company that builds rockets and sends things up into space, being bought out by probably like the hallmark old space company, Northrop Grumman, who, I mean, they made the B-2 bomber. They made many of the, was it Northrop Grumman or that built the lunar lander, or was that North American?
I think that was Northrop Grumman. I will look while you continue.
Yeah. So as for people,
transparency here on Ad Astra.
So for people who don't know what the big companies are in the old space world, you hear new space all the time. You think SpaceX, you think Blue Origin with Jeff Bezos, and Virgin Galactic with Richard Branson. But old space is a very wide field because it incorporates a lot of aerospace companies. It sort of combines air and space manufacturers, designers, and engineers and scientists. So this includes many of the folks that built the F-35 over at Lockheed Martin, or that built the B-2 bomber at Northrop Grumman. So across old space, you have companies as old as Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing, Douglas before it was bought out, and there's a sort of this thing that happened really in the early 90s when the Cold War ended. There was this understanding among all of the big aerospace companies, many of them dealing in the defense sector, that because of the wind down following the end of the Cold War, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, that there would be less of a need to be building, bigger bombs and bigger airplanes and bigger satellites, all of those. And the focus was going to be on making things smaller, more compact, more efficient. And they couldn't do that with the field of, I think it was something like 40 major government contractors, and a lot of them were bought out. Northrop Grumman bought out a lot of companies. Lockheed and Martin combined. Boeing bought out Douglas, if I'm getting this correctly.
Speaking of combined organizations, it was Grumman Aircraft that created the lunar lander.
And then you see Northrop and Grumman formed together, though I think that was a little bit earlier. That might have been in the mid to late 70s, I think.
Yeah, that was
so we saw in the early 90s this dwindling of the number of aerospace companies, specifically in the defense sector. And that also limited the number of competitors when it came to building rockets to send up NASA spacecraft. So before there was SpaceX and Blue Origin, even though Blue Origin's not launching anything quite yet, but before there was SpaceX, really you only had the option of a small Antares rocket from Orbital, at the time Orbital Sciences, or an Atlas V from Boeing, or Atlas V from Lockheed Martin, and a Delta IV from Boeing. And that was sort of your options. And now with this growth of the launch vehicle sector, you see companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, Sierra Nevada. There's a number of other companies that are still developing their payload delivery systems, but in launch vehicles. But there's a lot of companies out there that are filling this void that was left after the end of the Cold War. And so this is sort of the newest iteration, is Northrop Grumman is actually breaking into the launch vehicle industry in a way by purchasing Orbital ATK. I mean, Orbital ATK is mainly concerned with launching rockets at this point.
Well, you also have with Orbital ATK missile defense capabilities that are very unique, just in terms of in terms of the algorithms that go behind them, the construction of those missiles. And there's a lot of talk out there saying that, a lot of this is kind of coming on the heels of a lot of the North Korea tests of their tests of ICBMs and ballistic missiles. And that's kind of what's leading some of this talk. I think a lot of that is kind of rumor and hearsay, but I would wager a guess that is at least a part of this. The way it looks, just to get some facts on the ground, this deal cost Northrop Grumman about $9.2 billion total. I believe it was 7.8 in cash and 1.4 in debt.
Yep.
And Northrop is effectively going to make Orbital ATK a fourth division of their corporation. So it'll be interesting to see the role that they play both on the commercial space side as well as the aerospace and defense side.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things.
Don't be surprised if you see increased capabilities from Northrop. Coming out of this in terms of the defense side.
Well, Northrop Chief Executive Officer Wes Bush says on a call when they were announcing this, that clearly, as we watch what's happening around our globe, the rather rapid advance of some of our potential adversaries is quite concerning. So at the heart of this move is Northrop Grumman trying to break into that missile defense space system sphere. Which is predominantly dominated by United Launch Alliance, which is the company that is made up of Lockheed Martin and Boeing engineers to build the Atlas V and Delta IV rockets, and SpaceX. There are really only two main companies doing the heavy lifting. Orbital ATK is a small to medium launch vehicle and generally is used for more civil space missions. But with that capability now, with Northrop Grumman's ability to get defense contracts, this is going to increase the amount of interest they're going to have in these missile defense capabilities. It's also worth noting that Orbital ATK has a contract with NASA to launch cargo to the International Space Station. The contract is worth about $3.1 billion, and I think they've done their 6th or 4th launch. I can't remember how many they've done. They do them fairly frequently, and actually it was one of those that blew up on the launch pad in Wallops, Virginia, that destroyed that launch pad for close to 2 years. And now that Orbital is getting bought by Northrop Grumman, I'm interested to see how SpaceX now plays their commercial cargo and commercial crew game, since they're now competing not with a smaller company, but with a very big company.
I still think, they're going to be competing with this subdivision of Orbital ATK, but they certainly still have their own niche market. I think Northrop just kind of made themselves a powerhouse in several other areas of rocketry, which I'm interested in seeing going forward. But anyway, so stay tuned when it comes to that news, and we'll see how things go.
Definitely keep an eye on this. It'll be evolving over the next couple days. So I guess without further ado, we will go back to your regular scheduled broadcasting.
Hey, Emily, thanks for coming on to the show. We're absolutely happy to have you on. So why don't we get started just with just a couple of questions, telling folks who you are, kind of how did you end up in the business of STEM and space advocacy overall?
So the way I got into this was kind of a bit random. I had studied engineering for about 8 years. I did my undergrad in mechanical and aerospace engineering, and then I went to MIT for aeronautics and astronautics engineering, and then a science and policy degree. And then when I was graduating, I was looking for a job. And mostly I was looking for jobs in DC. I was hoping to do some type of science policy work, maybe with a focus on space. And I got a call from a production studio that was like, would you like to be the host of an outer space show on Fox? And I said yes, because I thought that sounded like an adventure. It sounded fun. And if it didn't go well, which, most shows don't get picked up again after their first
season. Especially on Fox.
I had 4, I had 4 science and engineering degrees to fall back on. But here we are, I'm in my 4th season of the show, Exploration Outer Space, and we've been picked up through 2020. So it's been going well. And I've just been kind of like expanding my science communication aspect of my career from that.
That's awesome. Oh, that's really amazing. So what do you see, what are some of the other activities that you have going on outside of the Exploration Outer Space show?
Yeah. So my most recent TV gig has been being a correspondent for Bill Nye on his Netflix show, Bill Nye Saves the World, which, as you can imagine, is pretty much a dream job. So that's been really fun. And I just came out with a series of chapter books that are based on a 3rd grader named Ada Lace, who is awesome about, with science and technology, and builds robots to solve mysteries and solve problems in her life.
Awesome. I love the nod to Ada Lovelace there.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. You had some sort of some tie to Ada Lovelace there. Like, did you study about her in school, or was it just a one-off thing?
I wanted to name the main character after a prominent woman in science, and Ada Lovelace has a pretty sweet name, and so
she does.
And a pretty sweet background, so named it after her. There's a few other Easter eggs of like names of scientists in the book, but yeah, it's been fun to try to combine my interests of science and tech and try to get a little creative with it with these books.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I guess our next question is just, who, of course, working with Bill, you that's your dream or a dream job. But other than him, what were some of your biggest inspirations to go into this field, this often niche field?
Yeah, I mean, I wish there were many, many more people to name, but, you know, in reality, it's Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson, and a little bit of Carl Sagan, because to me, as a kid growing up, I learned about Carl Sagan later in life, but my first introduction to science storytelling was Bill Nye, and then later Neil deGrasse Tyson. So those were the people that I looked up to. Those were the people that I admired, and I tried to learn from. And then when I got into my career more recently, the people that I admire are a lot of my peers, the people that are around my same age that mostly live on YouTube, that do science YouTube videos and do those in just really creative and interesting and funny, often really funny ways. So yeah, so those are the people that I really look up to now.
Interesting. Yeah, we talked a little bit about science YouTube videos last week, just in terms of favorite show. Jack, I don't know if you wanted me to get to that question just yet, because that was sort of our last question. But
yeah, we'll save that one for the end.
All right, that sounds good. As far as some of your so outside of television and active media, do you have any other activities going on in STEM right now?
Well, mostly other than the TV stuff and the book writing, I've covered in the past, you know, I've done tech journalism and I've covered the space industry and developments in the space industry. And then I do a lot of public speaking. I like to visit schools and talk about science and why I got into it in the first place, to try to encourage others to do it too.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I've seen that you've had some TEDx experience, right? So
yes.
you want to tell us a little bit about?
Yeah.
If you guys haven't checked it out, just go on TED, the TED website or the TED app, and you can hear Emily give a number of talks on STEM, on let's see, what other topics have you spoken on before? Twitter battling with famous rappers.
Yeah, exactly.
Inspiring STEM literacy, things like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone who's like trying to get better at being a science communicator, doing a TEDx talk is one of the best challenges that you can give yourself, because you have a limited amount of time. It is, you're practicing the art of storytelling, but trying to infuse real science in there. And so it challenges people who are traditionally used to speaking to a scientific audience where, you know, you're just presenting the facts and that's it. You don't want to get creative with it. And it challenges you to get creative with it, to draw people in to the personal connection of science and why they should care about the science. And it's just a terrifying challenge, but also a really fun one and a great learning experience.
So you have you have a fairly unique background, just in terms of being able. Well, you're an engineer. You're a full-on engineer, but you also have this ability to communicate, which is not something, as you know, is prevalent throughout our field. You know, like
not always.
Right. So, how. I mean, did you have any trouble in that arena, just like being willing to step outside of the engineering box and being willing to, you know, be a communicator, or were you just excited about it from the jump?
Well, I have like a theory about this, and for me, I think growing up as a girl, a lot of times our parents and our community are more likely to force the arts onto little girls than perhaps they are to little boys. Little boys, they, you know, force like trucks and maybe more science and techie and robots and stuff to them when they're younger. Right. And so I practiced a lot of art-related stuff, a lot of writing, a lot of storytelling when I was little, just because that was what happened to be put in front of me. And so I always enjoyed it because I practiced it a lot and I got good at it, and we generally like what we get good at. And so I loved I loved art. I loved writing. And then when I got into high school, I found that I also really loved math. And so originally I was thinking about going into architecture because that seemed to be a pretty good confluence of math and art. But my university in my home state didn't have architecture. So I decided to go into engineering instead. But I think because I had that strong artsy storytelling background through engineering, I felt like that was an asset that I could leverage. And so anytime there was a group project, I was the one that volunteered to present on behalf of the group because nobody else really wanted to do that. That was like a scary thing to do. But I felt like that was where I shined. And so because I continued to volunteer for those positions, I would get even more practice and get even better at it. And anytime there was, a required outreach event where somebody in your group had to go volunteer at a local school to give a presentation about science, I would do that as well. So it was repetitive, you just continue to get practice.
Absolutely.
It built off each other.
Very cool. Very cool.
And then to sort of drill down more into the, I guess maybe best practices. Like, what have you found? I mean, so in our conversation last week with Ingrid, we learned that the speaking to a specific person or an audience has a much better effect. And we see this in Bill's old show, the new show, Carl Sagan and Neil's Cosmos. But then also humor is a big part of communicating. What are I guess your best practices for communicating something as complex as solar system exploration?
Right. So humor is definitely a wonderful one, and that is one of the hardest ones to employ because learning how to be funny is such an art, and it takes a lot of practice. And for me, when I do public speaking, I'll typically test out a handful of jokes every talk that I do, and I'll make a mental note as to which ones of those got laughs. And, I'll often tell a joke and be like, well, probably shouldn't tell that one again. That one did not work. And then
just
make a note for the next time. Yeah, I guess. I've never done stand-up. That sounds terrifying, but that was probably a very good way to learn how to be funny. But I think my recommendation for people for how to get good at this is to learn empathy, because a lot of times the science that we're trying to explain, the most important parts of science communication deal with controversial science, or science that, is controversial to certain tribes of people. And when you're talking to your audience, it's good to know who your audience is, what they care about, and to tailor your message to them. For example, I'm from West Virginia. A lot of West Virginia was built on the coal mining industry. Their economy depended on it. A lot of my friends and family and people that I know from West Virginia, their families worked in the coal mines or had some relation to it. Their livelihood depended on it. And so when I talk about climate change, I need to keep that in mind, and that the way we combat climate change actively hurts their livelihood. And they're on the front lines of the people that are affected by combating climate change. And so knowing that, I can help tailor my message to them. And then when you're speaking to a conservative versus a liberal audience, when you're talking to a liberal audience, it's great to talk about the hippie side of climate change and the protect our earth, protect our environment, keep all of it green. But when you're talking to a conservative audience, don't mention polar bears. Don't mention anything about the environment. You mention things about how this affects national security or how this affects economic development. You have to speak their language and understand what they care about. So understanding empathy, understanding your audience can help you become a more effective science communicator.
That's interesting that you think about particularly the politics of the audience. This kind of goes back to the stand-up analogy because I know a lot of stand-up comedians that have to think about those things too. Just going back to that example on the liberal side, you may talk a little less or try to find better ways to talk about vaccines or GMOs if you're talking about getting the word about science out there. That's actually really interesting. I
Yeah.
didn't really have that thought, because from the science perspective, right? You're always just wanting to, from the person who's not necessarily a science communicator and just a straight up scientist, that perspective. I talk to a lot of folks who just want to dump information, but it's all about thinking about how people are going to receive that information. Because at the end of the day, the overall goal is for them to want to ingest your information and take it seriously. And
Mm-hmm.
and you don't want to walk down a path that that is going to make them shut down as soon as you start approaching them. You don't want to, like you said, you don't want to talk to a conservative audience about right away about climate change. You want to lead up to that in some respects.
So it's like the ends justify the means.
Right, exactly. Because if your goal is to change their minds, then you have to approach the communication differently. If your goal is just to make a point that is correct and to win an argument, then you're going to communicate in a totally different manner.
Absolutely.
But, because it's also, I think the other part of it is that you can't be snarky. If I recently had like a disagreement with a fellow science communicator on Twitter, and this person was so snarky and so condescending to me in this back and forth that when I left this conversation, I was just like, I finally understand why smart people don't believe climate change exists. Yep. Because if anybody, like if I didn't know something about climate change and somebody, a scientist or whoever, approached me about climate change the way that this person approached me about this topic we were talking about, I would, out of spite, not ever believe in climate change ever again.
Right. And I think that's a lot. That I honestly think that is a lot of what it is. From climate change to, climate change is a common example that we often use because a lot of the people that we hang around are fairly liberal. But from climate change to vaccines to GMOs, like if you approach someone in a way that doesn't immediately make them, raise their guard, raise their defenses, then they'll be willing to actually sit down and learn from you and have an honest conversation with you. But it all depends on how that conversation starts. I absolutely agree. So
exactly
so you have clearly a special skill, right? I mean, I think it's obvious from your TEDx talks and from a lot of the other things that you've done, that you have a skill for communicating, which you've already explained. But what ideas would you have going forward, or potentially advice would you have going forward for scientists or engineers to either be the science communicators or effectively have some sort of framework for syncing up with science writers and bloggers? Because I know you've talked to quite a bit of them as well, in order to produce science writings that actually permeate the masses and don't give this notion of, this is a political debate or I'm right, you're wrong. What advice would you have for scientists and engineers who are looking to reach out to do that and maybe don't necessarily have the communication skills to carry that forward, or don't believe that they do?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I've found that most of the discourse on science, at least in my bubble, in my community, happens on Twitter. And Twitter is not something that I think a lot of scientists and engineers feel comfortable being on, or maybe they don't understand why they would make the extra effort to add another, social network to their.
You can't write a peer review paper in 140 characters. It's just not.
Right. And I think there's like that trade-off of like, if you're spending time on Twitter communicating your science, do you have to feel guilty because you're not working, you're not spending that time working in a lab? And I think we have to throw away the stigma, because it's so important to share your knowledge and share the work that you do with others, that we should make it totally normal and encouraged for scientists and engineers to be on mediums like Twitter to share their work, because it's a great way to practice communicating very difficult scientific topics in 140 characters or less.
Absolutely.
And it's not always the perfect medium for sharing science, but it is a really good place to start. And for me, I don't check like the New York Times every day. I check Twitter. I check the face of Twitter, and then that's where I find all the articles that I read, because it's just a good way to curate your news. And of course, you click on the articles on Twitter, but that's where I find a lot of scientists and engineers that I personally follow. So they're on there. I just wish there were more of them.
Interesting. Yeah, I honestly don't know that many scientists or engineers that use Twitter. I think Facebook is kind of the common medium. I mean, obviously I'm thinking about people within my bubble. I think Facebook is typically the common medium for publishing scientific, news or some sort of science writing. I think I've only recently, within the last year or two, started using Twitter a bit more. But yeah, I definitely think that a lot of scientists and engineers, and obviously we don't have actual survey data, but tend to run away from it a bit. Then maybe a lot of that is based on the notion that it's 140 characters or less.
And then also that you can get buried so quickly in just all of the stuff that's going on. That's always been my apprehension about Twitter, is that it's one of those places that ideas, if you're not posting in prime hours, you might as well not be saying anything at all. And I can see how that could turn someone off who thinks that their research is so important and that it's not something that you should just throw away or not look at.
Right. So, one thing that I've been thinking of as we've been having these discussions, talking about sort of the last science guy and this role that scientists and engineers have to play in terms of the public, and relaying information to the public. And you brought this thought to mind when you were talking about some of your previous experience in school. What do you think the role of mathematicians would be in it should be in all of this? There are a lot of I've been hearing a lot of results from scientists and engineers, just out there permeating the space. You have Neil deGrasse Tyson, you have Bill Nye, you have Brian Greene, you have all of these folks. What do you think the role that math and sort of getting common knowledge about mathematics out there should play in all of this in terms of STEM? Have you used mathematics a lot in some of the STEM speeches or STEM activities that you've done in local schools?
Well, I guess yes, but that's like a little bit specific, I think, because it's not like I wouldn't say that I use like any specific engineering only in any of my talks. Like all of my talks, when you're thinking about like STEM, you sort of combine all of them in your message, because a general message that you're talking about is probably going to include a little bit of everything, a little bit of science, a little bit of math, tech, and engineering. So yeah, with math, I mean, it's definitely included in there, but I wouldn't say it's focused on necessarily.
Interesting. Yeah, that's one thing that I've noticed, kind of just in my own personal travels, is the emphasis on mathematics in certain places, because I know at least for me, that was always one of the more compelling, one of the more compelling channels from which I would understand science, is sort of understanding the mathematics behind it, or sort of the logic behind it. And I know there's sort of this mentality in our culture, and this goes back to the last science guy talk that we've been talking about since episode 8 of this podcast. But there's sort of this notion in our society that there are folks who are very mathematics focused, and then there's everyone else. And one of the things that we've sort of been promoting here is, well, mathematics is something that's for everyone, and it's actually a good way of understanding why some of the scientific results that you see out there are true. right? Maybe you don't need to know all of the underlying mathematics behind it, but you'll know based on some mathematical approach that what this group found about climate change is true, or what this group found about, vaccines or GMOs or what have you is true. And I feel like that's a bit underemphasized in the way that STEM is talked about today. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that a lot of times the stuff that you're referring to is a little bit too granular for a lot of the audiences that would generally be spoken to, like just a general layperson audience. So that perhaps that's why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I just find that that a lot of STEM talks are very focused on scientific results and engineering results, as opposed to maybe some discussion about. And I'm not saying go out there and prove prove Kepler's laws or anything like that when talking about space, but at least giving credence to that or having some form of education about that may be a path forward in getting the public to understand or appreciate some of the scientific results that are out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what was a minute physics sort of does
Right.
that, is sort of contextualizes the math in regards to some topic that's going on. I know they try to keep up to date, so they'll do something on the Large Hadron Collider, or they'll do something about infrared spectrometers on remote imaging satellites. So I think maybe weaving that in as the public consciousness around science grows. I mean, I already know that people who are in school now are learning scientific concepts quicker because they already have a base understanding from watching Bill Nye or watching PBS or early educational programming. So that it's like every generation of science people adds onto that existing knowledge from the generation before, which I guess could also be a cause for some concern for those who think that the science is moving too fast or that it's not aligning with their worldview. And I guess maybe that's also sort of where science communicators like us come in to sort of bridge that knowledge gap that might exist. I mean, the scientific method isn't as widely used as it is taught in schools.
Well, but it's a way of knowing that someone's approach is valid, right? Like that. I think that's more along the lines of what it is. I mean, I can't honestly say that that the pure scientific method has ever been used. Well, no, it certainly has been used, but the pure scientific method was followed as a very clean-cut series of events in any research and development that was ever done. You follow a rough. It's a rough guide to discovering truth.
It's guidelines, not rules.
But I feel like you use it as a very high-level guide, and then you use both empirical data and mathematics to get you there, which is kind of why I was emphasizing that notion of, perhaps, is there a way that we could emphasize the mathematics in this space to compel people to understand and maybe even appreciate a bit more the science?
Well, I think that's going to be the job for the next science guy or gal. But as we sort of wrap up our conversation here, maybe to harken back to what our final question of last week was when we were talking to Ingrid. Newton, you and I have already answered this question, but Emily hasn't. Other than Bill Nye's both of the shows, I know you have a bias towards one of them, and the Cosmos and both the Carl and Neil version, any show that Neil was on. Emily, what is your favorite science communication show? YouTube, television, whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I have a slew of them because you use them for different things. So my kind of cluster of shows that I love are like the PBS shows. So Diana, the physics girl. I love Vanessa Hill with Braincraft. I feel like that's a really creative show. I love Anna Rothschild with Gross Science. And then, of course, like Veritasium and Vsauce. So those are the ones that I think I really gravitate to. Because they're really creative and they're often funny, and the people are young. It's like just nice in general to be taught science from somebody who, isn't an old white guy.
Sure.
I think those are all great choices. My choice was Mythbusters was my just all-time favorite, but Vsauce, Minute Physics, Hank Green's SciShow is also one. I don't know if you checked that out, but that one is also really good. And they have a space spinoff, I think, called The Space Show. So all very, very interesting stuff.
Awesome.
So Emily, again, thank you for coming on the show and talking to us about your experience as a science person, a science communicator.
Of course.
So if our listeners want to follow up, want to, follow you on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat. I don't know how many social medias you are involved with, but where can the folks find you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at the Space Gal.
All right, and it sounds like you have a lot of cool stuff coming up. Is there a book tour in your in the future?
Well, I basically just go to bookstores in any city that I'm traveling in. So I've hit maybe 4 states so far in the first couple weeks that it's been out. So they're all in Barnes and Nobles all around the country, and Books A Million if you're on the East Coast. So yeah, so they're everywhere. I'm trying to sign as many as possible. But if you're in the Pennsylvania, West Virginia area, I have my first book signing on October 1st from 12 to 2 p.m. at the Barnes and Noble there at the University Town Center.
Very cool. Very cool.
Great. And that's not too far of a drive from DC.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really not. I'll have to pick one up for my niece.
And yeah, of course, if you are ever in the DC area, we will more than happily put on a red carpet premiere of Adelace at the Barnes and Noble of your choosing. Or is there a Books A Million still in DC, Newton?
That's a very good question. I believe there is. I just can't tell you where it is.
There was one in DuPont, but I'm not sure if it's still there anymore.
Yeah. There's certainly Barnes and Nobles around the DC area. So
yeah, so that'll be what we do. So yeah, I guess that about wraps up our conversation. Emily, is there anything else you would like to tell the listeners?
No, that's good. I mean, I guess the only other thing is my season 4 of my Exploration Outer Space show is now airing. New episodes each week. It's on Fox Saturday mornings. Check your local listings. It's also on Hulu and YouTube TV and Amazon Prime and basically anywhere and everywhere you can watch television.
Geez, you're taking over the internet and soon the world.
Exactly.
But yeah, so we're also going to include links to all the stuff that we talked about today in the show notes. But yeah, I guess, Newton, is there anything else that you want to say?
No, thanks. Once again, thanks again for being on, Emily.
Of course. Thanks, guys, for having me.
All right. Take care.
All right. Well, as always, I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
Ad Astra.